Kokoda track, Papua New Guinea, late 1942. An Australian soldier lies face down in mud that reaches his chest. He is 20 years old. He cannot see 3 feet in front of him. He can hear the Japanese patrol coming, boots on wet leaves, low voices in a language he does not understand, closing in. His rifle is jammed. His hands are shaking. He has about 15 seconds left to live. He raises the only weapon he has left. A strange-looking submachine gun with the magazine sticking straight up out of the top. A gun the Australian Army once called ridiculous. A gun his own generals had tried to bury in a filing cabinet before the war even began. He pulls the trigger, and he goes home. This is the story of the gun that should not have existed, the gun that beat the British Sten and the American Thompson in the only conditions that ever mattered. This is the Owen Machine Carbine, and the man who designed it had never held an engineering degree in his life. To understand how that weapon ended up in that soldier's hands, we have to go back 1 year to a rifle range outside Sydney. Long Bay Rifle Range, New South Wales. September 29th, 1941. The morning is cold, the kind of Sydney cold that seeps through wool uniforms and settles in the bones. On a wooden bench, 3 submachine guns are laid out in a neat row, waiting. The first is a Sten Mark I, British, stamped from sheet metal, welded together in improvised wartime workshops back in England. It looks like a length of pipe with a handle. Cheap. Ugly. Effective, they said, in the alleyways of occupied France. The second is a Thompson M1928A1, American, machined from solid steel, finished with the care of a precision instrument, priced at nearly $200 a unit. This is the gun the newsreels made famous, the gun of gangsters and Marines, heavy, beautiful. Reliable, they said, from the deserts of North Africa to the Straits of Chicago. The third gun does not look like it belongs on the same bench. Its magazines sticks straight up out of the top of the receiver, jutting into the air like a broken antenna. The ejection port faces downward, pointing at the dirt. The sights are offset to the left side of the barrel because the magazine blocks the center. The whole thing looks like it was welded together in a shed by a man who had never seen a proper firearm in his life. The officers standing on the range exchange glances. A few of them smile. One of them mutters something under his breath about wasting a good morning. Then the test begins. The 3 guns are picked up one at a time and pushed face first into a shallow pit filled with wet sand and mud. Not dropped, buried. The testers grind them down into the muck, work the mud into every crevice, every seam, every opening. Then they pull them out, hand them back, and give the order. Fire. The Thompson goes first. The tester racks the bolt. It moves an inch and stops. Mud has gotten into the action. He tries again. Nothing. He tries a third time. The gun is dead. $200 of American precision, and it will not fire a single round. The Sten goes next. The tester racks the bolt. It moves. He pulls the trigger. There is a sharp crack, but it is not the sound of a bullet leaving a barrel. It is the sound of a receiver failing, metal tearing. Something has gone catastrophically wrong inside the gun. An observer standing 2 close doubles over. He will be taken to hospital before the day is out. The Sten Mark I, the British answer to the submachine gun problem, has exploded in front of the men who were meant to buy it. And then they hand the ugly Australian gun to the tester. He works the bolt. It moves cleanly. He raises the weapon to his shoulder. He pulls the trigger. The gun fires. And it keeps firing. 33 rounds, one after the other, until the magazine is empty. No jams, no stoppages, no failures. Every single round goes exactly where it is meant to go. The officers are not smiling anymore. This is the Owen Machine Carbine, and the man who designed it had never held an engineering degree in his life. To understand why the Owen mattered, you have to understand what Australia was about to face in the Pacific by the end of 1941. The Japanese Empire had moved faster than any Western power believed possible. Malaya had fallen. Singapore, the great British fortress in the East, had surrendered in February with over 80,000 Allied troops taken prisoner. The Dutch East Indies were gone, and Japanese forces were pushing south into Papua New Guinea, into terrain that no European army had ever fought in properly. The conditions there were not difficult. They were murderous. Temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius. Humidity that never dropped below 90%. Torrential rain every afternoon, turning tracks into rivers and forest floors into swamps. Mud that could swallow a soldier up to the waist. And engagements that happened not at hundreds of yards, but at 10, sometimes 5, sometimes close enough that a man could see the whites of the eyes of the man trying to kill him. The Australian soldier arriving in New Guinea carried a Lee Enfield rifle, a magnificent weapon in the trenches of Flanders, accurate at 500 yards, slow, bolt action, and in a jungle ambush where the first 3 seconds decided who lived and who died, the Lee Enfield was a death sentence. Australia needed a submachine gun, a weapon that could throw a wall of bullets in the direction of an enemy who had appeared out of nowhere. And Australia needed it now. The British had one, the Sten. It cost about $10 to produce. It was ugly, unreliable in the wrong conditions, but it could be manufactured by the millions. The Americans had one too, the Thompson. Beautifully made, devastatingly powerful, with its .45 caliber round. It cost 20 times more than the Sten and weighed nearly 5 kilograms empty. Neither had been tested in the mud of the equator. Neither had been asked to survive what an Australian soldier was about to face on the Kokoda track. That was the problem waiting for a solution. The man who would solve it was not a general. He was not an engineer. He was not even, by any reasonable measure, a competent adult. Evelyn Ernest Owen was born on the 15th of May, 1915, in Wollongong, New South Wales. He was the fourth of 5 children. His mother came from a family of some standing. His grandfather was Sir William Macmillan, a former federal politician. On paper, Evelyn had every advantage a young Australian could ask for. On paper. In practice, he left Wollongong High School without distinction. He tried to run a small business, selling ready-mixed mortar. It failed. He drifted from one thing to another, and the only subject that held his attention was firearms. He was not a hunter. He was not a marksman. What Evelyn Owen loved was the mechanism, the way metal parts moved against each other under pressure, the way a trigger pull translated into a spinning bolt and a spent case flying through the air. He was obsessed with the machine of it, and he had almost no idea what he was doing. When he was in his mid-teens, he built a homemade explosive device. He wanted to see what it would do. He set it off. The device detonated too early, and Evelyn took a piece of shrapnel to the stomach. He was lucky to survive. He learned nothing from the experience. A few years later, he was tinkering with an old rifle. He wanted to test a modified bolt he had made himself. The rifle discharged. Evelyn shot himself again. Different wound. Same underlying cause. A young man who could not stop himself from touching the dangerous thing to see how it worked. By 1931, at the age of 16, he had already begun sketching designs for a submachine gun. By 1938, he had built one. The prototype was not elegant. It was chambered in .22 rimfire, the smallest common cartridge available, because that was the ammunition he could afford. The receiver was cobbled together from cut-down rifle parts. The magazine was a drum, and part of that drum had been fashioned from the cylinder of an old revolver. There was no conventional trigger. To fire the weapon, you pressed down with your thumb. It was, by any reasonable engineering standard, a joke. But it fired. When Evelyn Owen pulled the makeshift thumb trigger, the little .22 rounds came out of the barrel in a stream. The action cycled. The gun worked. In July of 1939, he took his prototype to Victoria Barracks in Sydney. Victoria Barracks was the administrative heart of the Australian military. If you wanted the army to look at your invention, this was where you went. Evelyn Owen was 24 years old. He walked into the ordnance office with his homemade gun and asked to speak to someone who could evaluate it. An officer met him. The officer looked at the weapon. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the drum magazine made partly from a revolver cylinder, and the thumb trigger and the ammunition that no serious army used. Then he told Evelyn Owen what he thought. This, the officer said, was an American gangster's gun. The Australian Army had no doctrine for submachine guns. The Australian Army had no interest in submachine guns. The Australian Army did not want anything to do with this weapon or its inventor. Come back when you have something serious. Or, better yet, don't come back at all. Evelyn Owen carried the gun home to Wollongong. And here is where the story could have ended, because Evelyn Owen was not a fighter, not in the sense of a man who takes a rejection and turns it into fuel. He was a tinkerer, a dreamer. And when the army told him his life's work was worthless, he believed them. For the next year, the prototype sat. Then, in May of 1940, with the war in Europe expanding and Australia calling for volunteers, Evelyn Owen did something that suggests he had given up on his invention entirely. He enlisted. On the 25th of May, 1940, he joined the 2-17 Infantry Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force. He was assigned to Bathurst for training. He would be, if everything went according to plan, a rifleman, one of thousands, anonymous. Before he left Wollongong, he took the prototype gun and wrapped it in a Hessian sack. A rough sack, the kind used for hauling sugar. He carried it out into the yard behind his flat and leaned it against a garden wall. He did not lock it away. He did not entrust it to anyone. He simply left it there, propped against a wall, wrapped in burlap, waiting for weather or rust or someone else to decide its fate. The man who had spent 9 years of his life designing a submachine gun had, in the end, abandoned it in a sack by a fence. That should have been the end. It was not the end because of a coincidence so improbable that if you wrote it into a novel, an editor would ask you to change it. Vincent Wardell was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, practical. The manager of the Lysott Steel works at Port Kembla, one of the largest industrial operations in New South Wales. Vincent Wardell knew steel. He knew engineering. He knew what a well-made piece of machinery looked like, and he knew what a poorly made one looked like too. And Vincent Wardell happened to live next door to the Owens. In September of 1940, some months after, Evelyn had gone to Bathurst. Vincent Wardell was walking near the property line between the two houses. He noticed a Hessian sack propped against the garden wall. Something inside it was heavy. Something inside it was shaped strangely. He picked it up. He unwrapped it. And he found himself holding a submachine gun. Vincent Wardell's first instinct was the sensible one. This was 1940. Australia was at war. The country was on edge about spies, saboteurs, fifth columnists. A homemade automatic weapon in a burlap sack behind a suburban house was not something a responsible citizen kept quiet about. His first thought was to take it straight to the police. But something stopped him. Curiosity, perhaps, or the engineer's eye recognizing that what he was holding was not the crude, dangerous thing a police officer would see. Vincent Wardell looked at the mechanism. He looked at the way the parts fit together. He looked at the top-mounted magazine and the downward ejection port. And even in this rough, thumb-triggered prototype, He saw something that a trained ordnance officer at Victoria Barracks had missed. He saw a solution. Instead of going to the police, Vincent Wardell went to see Evelyn Owen's father. He explained what he had found. He explained what he thought it might be, and together they agreed that this gun deserved a second look. Vincent Wardell brought in his brother. Gerard Wardell was the chief engineer at Lissatz. He knew production. He knew tolerances. He knew how to take a rough idea and turn it into something a factory could actually build. Gerard looked at Evelyn Owen's prototype and reached the same conclusion Vincent had. This was crude. This was ugly. This was, in some ways, embarrassing. But the fundamental idea was right. They brought in a third man. Frederick Kunzler was a Swiss-trained engineer working at Lissatz, a specialist in precision mechanical design. Between Gerard Wardell and Freddie Kunzler, the Owen prototype now had two professional engineers refining it, and behind them stood Vincent Wardell, using his position as manager of one of Australia's largest steel works to make sure the project got the attention it needed. Word reached Essington Lewis. Lewis was, at that moment, one of the most powerful men in Australia. As Director General of Munitions, he controlled the flow of every rifle, every shell, every truck, every uniform the Australian war effort produced. If Essington Lewis decided a project mattered, that project got resources. If he decided it did not, no amount of engineering brilliance would save it. Lewis heard about the Owen gun. He ordered Evelyn Owen transferred out of the 2-17 Infantry Battalion, out of Bathurst, out of the rifleman's life that Evelyn had resigned himself to. Owen was sent to Melbourne. He was attached to the Central Inventions Board. He was given engineers, materials, a workshop, and something he had never had before in his life. He was given a real chance. For a brief moment, standing in Melbourne in the last months of 1940, 25-year-old Evelyn Owen must have thought he had won. That the fight was over, that the Army had come to its senses, that his years of tinkering, his 2 accidental gunshot wounds, his failed mortar business, his rejection at Victoria Barracks, all of it had been worth something. He thought the war for his invention was finished. He was wrong, because the real war for the Owen gun had not yet begun. It would not be fought against the Japanese. It would not be fought against the Germans. It would be fought against the Australian Army itself. And it would nearly kill the project before a single production gun ever left the factory. The Owen was about to enter the bureaucratic wilderness. It would spend the next 12 months there. And what happened inside those 12 months would decide whether Australian soldiers in New Guinea lived or died. Melbourne, late 1940. Evelyn Owen walks into a workshop for the first time in his life as an inventor with official standing. He has a desk. He has engineers to talk to. He has the authority of the Director General of Munitions behind his name. He believes the hard part is over. Within weeks, he learns how wrong he is. The first request from the Australian Army arrives in January of 1941. The Army wants a prototype in .32 ACP. This is an unusual caliber. It is a pistol round used by some European police forces. Nobody uses it for a military submachine gun. But the Army has asked. So Owen and the Lesat's team build one. They machine the parts. They fit the barrel. They deliver the weapon. The Army looks at it. The Army makes notes. The Army asks for something else. In March of 1941, the request changes. Now the Army wants 45 ACP. This is the American round. The Thompson round, a large, heavy bullet with real stopping power. Fine. Owen and his team retool. They rechamber, they rebuild. Then the ammunition arrives, and it is the wrong ammunition. The Army has sent them 4.55 Webley cartridges, a British revolver round, longer than 45 ACP, physically incapable of fitting the chamber they just built. Owen stands in the workshop holding a box of ammunition that will not load into the gun they were told to design. Somebody in the Ordnance Department has made a mistake. Or somebody has not made a mistake at all. Somebody has done exactly what they meant to do. In July of 1941, the request changes again. Now it is 38 Smith & Wesson. Owen and the team rebuild the weapon a third time. They test it. The round is underpowered. The action will not cycle reliably. The gun that has been proving itself on paper for months cannot function with the ammunition the Army has specified. Not until September of 1941 does the Army finally agree to the round Owen wanted from the beginning. 9mm Parabellum, the standard submachine gun cartridge of the world. The round the Sten uses, the round the German MP-40 uses. The round every serious military in Europe has already settled on. 9 months have been lost. 9 months of chambering and rechambering, of building prototypes that had no future, of solving problems that never needed to exist. And somewhere inside the Department of the Army, a man named Major Howell sits down at his desk and writes something in an internal memorandum that historians will find decades later. He writes that there appears to be, in the handling of the Owen gun project, a marked hostility. He uses the phrase verging on deliberate obstruction. He is not talking about the enemy. He is not talking about the Japanese or the Germans or the Italians. He is talking about his own colleagues. He is talking about the Australian Army, the institution that is supposed to want this weapon, is instead fighting to kill it in its cradle. The civilian government has to override its own generals. Frank Ford, the Minister for the Army, and Essington Lewis at Munitions are the ones keeping the project alive, not the uniformed men. The politicians and the industrialists. The Australian Army has, in effect, decided that a gun invented by a young man in a shed is not a gun worth having, and it is prepared to sabotage the process until the answer becomes true. While the bureaucratic war grinds on, something remarkable is happening in the workshop at Port Kembla. Evelyn Owen, working alongside Gerard Wardell and Freddie Kunzler, is refining his design into something that will change infantry warfare in the Pacific. The finished Owen gun is not beautiful. It never will be. But every strange thing about it, every awkward angle and offset sight, exists for a reason. The magazine sits on top of the receiver, not on the bottom like the Thompson, not on the side like the Sten, on top. Gravity does half the work of the magazine spring. Rounds fall into the chamber, whether the spring is strong or weak, clean or dirty. In a jungle where every spring is going to weaken, where every magazine is going to get filled with grit, this changes everything. The ejection port faces straight down. When mud gets into the action, it does not pool inside the receiver. It falls out through the bottom, pushed clear by gravity every time the bolt cycles. But the true innovation, the thing that separates the Owen from every other submachine gun in the world, is hidden inside the receiver, where nobody can see it. The Owen has an internal bulkhead. A small wall of steel divides the receiver into two separate compartments. The bolt cycles in the forward chamber, sealed away. The charging handle operates in the rear chamber. The two are connected only by a pinhole, just large enough for the recoil spring guide rod to pass through. This means that when a soldier is crawling through a swamp on the Kokoda track and his cocking handle slot fills with mud and river water and rotting leaves, none of that filth can reach the bolt. None of it can reach the chamber. None of it can jam the action. This is the failure point that killed the Sten in every mud test. The cocking slot let contamination straight into the working parts. Owen sealed it off with one small wall of steel. The finished production Owen weighs 4.22 kilograms. It fires 9mm parabellum from a 33-round magazine. It cycles at around 700 rounds per minute. It is not the fastest submachine gun in the world. It is not the lightest. It is not the prettiest. But it will not stop firing. September the 29th, 1941. Long Bay Rifle Range, Sydney. The three guns lie on the bench. The Sten Mark I, the Thompson M928A1, the Owen in 9mm parabellum. The trial protocol has been written to be as cruel as anyone in Australia can imagine. Sand poured directly into the actions while the guns are firing. Full immersion in water, deep enough to soak every internal part. Burial in mud, followed by immediate firing attempts with no cleaning permitted. Then an endurance phase. 3,000 rounds through each weapon, back to back, no maintenance allowed. The Owen goes through every stage, every round, every condition, not one stoppage, not one jam, not one failure of any kind. The Thompson fires beautifully when it is clean. After the mud, it seizes. The action will not move. The most expensive submachine gun on the range is beaten by dirt. Then it is the Sten's turn. The tester works the bolt. He pulls the trigger. The Sten explodes. The receiver, made of stamped sheet metal, cannot handle the combination of contamination and pressure. Something inside gives way. According to the monograph published by Wayne Wardman in 1991, an observer standing near the firing point is injured badly enough to be sent to hospital. The British answer to the submachine gun problem has just blown itself apart in front of the men who were meant to buy it. And the Australian gun, the ugly one, the one built in a workshop by men whose own army had called their work amateur, is still firing. You would think the argument is over. You would be wrong. The Department of Munitions still hesitates. There are agreements with Britain, commitments about Sten production under license. There are careers tied to those commitments. There are men who have staked their reputations on the idea that the Sten is the future. Frank Ford, the Minister for the Army, has had enough. He personally orders a second trial. This one will be filmed. There will be a permanent record. There will be no ambiguity, no room for the ordnance men to write reports that quietly bury the results. December the 22nd, 1941. The cameras roll. 20th Century Fox Movietone News, the company that puts newsreels in front of audiences in every cinema in the Western world, is present to record what happens. An independent observer has been brought in from Canada. Lieutenant Colonel L. Moore Cosgrave, the Canadian Trade Commissioner, he is a professional soldier. He has no stake in Australian factional politics. The three guns are put through the trial again. The result is the same. The Owen fires. The Thompson jams. The Sten fails. Cosgrave writes home to the Canadian High Commissioner. He says he is completely satisfied that the conditions of the test were, as nearly as possible, equivalent to severe actual service conditions. Major General E.J. Milford, one of the officers who had opposed the Owen from the beginning, is present. He watches the test, and he does something that must have cost him, professionally, whatever pride he had left. He admits, in writing, that the Owen continued to function satisfactorily under severe conditions. The war inside the Army is over. The Owen has won. Production begins at Lysot's Port Kembla in March of 1942. And almost immediately, a new rival appears, the Austin gun, a hybrid design built by combining features of the British Sten with features of the German MP40. Some officials in the Australian government prefer it. They see it as a compromise, a way to honor the commitment to Sten pattern weapons while still producing something in Australia. For a time, the Austin and the Owen are produced in parallel. Two Australian submachine guns competing for the same soldiers, the same ammunition, the same factory space. The competition is settled by the men in the jungle. In New Guinea, in late 1942, Australian soldiers get their hands on both weapons. They vote with their lives. The Owen goes forward on patrol. The Austin stays behind. In total, only about 20,000 Austins will ever be made. The Owen will pass 45,000 before the war ends. By the last months of 1942, the Owen is where it belongs. In the mud, in the rain, on the Kokoda track, in the terrible fighting at Buna and Gona, at Wau and Salamaua, at Lae, and along the Huon Peninsula. The doctrine is simple. 2 Owens per 10-man infantry section. 1 for the section commander. 1 for the forward scout, the man who walks point, the man most likely to trigger the ambush. If you were the scout, if you were the first man down the track, the Owen in your hands was the difference between coming home and not. New Zealand commandos on Guadalcanal, fighting alongside American units, quietly trade in their Thompsons whenever they can get an Owen instead. Colin Lawson documents this in his 1946 book, Pacific Commandos. The commandos are not making a political statement. They are making a survival decision. The gun the Australian Army did not want has become the gun the soldiers of 3 nations cannot live without. And the news is about to travel a great deal further than New Guinea. Somewhere in the Southwest Pacific in 1943, the highest-ranking American soldier in the theater reads a report on a weapon he has never fired. General Douglas MacArthur is not a man who is easily impressed. He commands American forces across half an ocean. He has the industrial might of the United States behind him. His soldiers carried the Thompson, the finest submachine gun American money can buy. And yet, according to widely repeated accounts from the period when he reads the field reports coming out of New Guinea, he sends a request through official channels. He wants 60,000 Owen guns for American troops. 60,000. Not a trial batch, not a curiosity order. 60,000 production weapons meant to be issued to American soldiers who would otherwise carry a Thompson made in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Australia cannot fulfill the order. There are not enough machine tools. There is not enough steel. The Lisatz plant at Port Kembla is running at capacity, and capacity is not enough. The country that had ridiculed the Owen, the army that had tried to sabotage it, the ordnance officers who had called it an American gangster's gun, now watch as the actual commander of American forces in the Pacific begs for it, and they cannot deliver. American soldiers who do get their hands on Owens through unofficial channels or by trading with Australian mates report the same thing every time. The Owen is more reliable than the Thompson. The gun that costs 12 Australian pounds to make is beating the gun that costs 200 American dollars. That is a hard thing to swallow if you are an American officer in 1943. The final judgment comes not from MacArthur, not from the Australians, it comes from the British. In December of 1943, the British Ordnance Board convenes a comparative trial. 5 submachine guns are tested against each other under standardized conditions. The Sten is there. The Australian Austin is there. So is a new British prototype, the Patchett, which will one day become the Sterling submachine gun of the post-war British Army. And the Owen is there. The board tests them in 4 categories of performance, and a 5th for overall merit. When the results are tallied, the Owen finishes first in 4 of the 5 categories. It finishes first overall. The empire that produced the Sten, the empire whose gun exploded on the range at Long Bay. That empire, with its centuries of arms-making tradition, ranks the Owen ahead of its own weapon. The gun, made by a young man in a shed in Wollongong, refined by a Swiss engineer and a steel mill manager, is now officially the best submachine gun in the British Commonwealth. The war ends. The Owen does not. Korea. April of 1951. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, is dug in on a ridge near a village called Kapyong. Chinese forces are attacking in waves. Human wave assaults. Hundreds of men at a time, coming up the slopes in the darkness. This is what the Owen was made for. Close range. Overwhelming numbers. No time to aim. No time to think. A major named Ben O'Dowd is there. He is a professional soldier. After the battle, he records his observations for the official record. He writes that the Owen submachine gun is the most effective weapon for repelling the mass Chinese attacks. He writes that the bolt action Lee Enfield is the worst. A gun designed by a 24-year-old dropout, rejected by the Australian Army in 1939, is keeping Australian soldiers alive on a Korean hillside 12 years later. The Owen goes on. The Malayan Emergency, starting in 1955. The Indonesian Confrontation, from 1963 through 1966, the early years of Australia's involvement in Vietnam. Every jungle war of the second half of the 20th century, the Owen is there. It is not officially retired until around 1971. Nearly 30 years of continuous service, from the mud of Kokoda to the mud of the Mekong Delta. When the Australian Army finally designs a replacement, the F-1 submachine gun, adopted in 1962, they make a specific decision about the layout. The magazine on the F-1 sits on top of the receiver, just like the Owen, the same top-mounted magazine that ordnance officers had once ridiculed as amateurish, as unprofessional, as the mark of a man who did not understand firearms. The same design choice that a boy in Wollongong had made because it worked. 30 years after his prototype was rejected at Victoria Barracks, the Australian Army was quietly admitting he had been right all along. 45,000 Owen guns were made at the Lysot's works at Port Kembla during the war. Over 500,000 magazines. The unit cost stayed between 10 and 12 Australian pounds, compared to nearly $200 for a Thompson. Lysot's built the guns on a cost plus 4% contract. Their net profit on the entire program was around 1.5%. They did not get rich making the Owen. They made it because Australia needed it. The soldiers who carried it gave it a name. They called it the Digger's Darling. Digger is the Australian word for a soldier, going back to the Australians who dug the trenches at Gallipoli in 1915. The Digger's Darling, the soldier's sweetheart. The gun, the man in the mud loved because it never failed him. In 2017, more than 70 years after the last production, Owen left the factory. Engineers Australia formally nominated the weapon for Engineering Heritage Recognition. A professional body of the country's engineers, looking back at the 20th century, decided that this ugly, awkward, brilliant little gun deserved to be remembered as one of the great achievements of Australian engineering. Evelyn Owen was not there to see it. He was not there for any of it. Not for MacArthur's request. Not for the British Ordnance Board verdict. Not for Capion. Not for the F1. Not for the Heritage nomination. He was there for the beginning, and then he was gone. After the war, Owen received his royalties, about 10,000 Australian pounds, a significant sum in 1946. Not a fortune, not the kind of money that changes a life if the life is not already built to receive it. He bought a sawmill. He tried to make it work. He lived alone. The man who had spent his youth obsessed with mechanisms, who had watched his invention rejected by the army and then rescued by a neighbor who had built the weapon that armed a generation of Australian soldiers, now spent his days in a small sawmill in New South Wales. He began to drink, not casually, heavily, steadily. The kind of drinking that is not a habit, but a slow surrender. The gun that saved thousands of lives could not save the life of the man who made it. On the 1st of April, 1949, Evelyn Ernest Owen was admitted to Wollongong Hospital with a ruptured gastric ulcer. It was a condition brought on, or at least accelerated, by years of heavy drinking. He died there. He was 33 years old. Eleanor Owen, his sister, was a sculptor. Some years later, she cast a bronze bust of her brother. It stands in Wollongong today, near the town where he was born, where he built his first prototype, where he left it wrapped in a Hessian sack against a garden wall in 1940. Veterans who had carried the Owen through the war made pilgrimages, not to Evelyn's grave, but to the Lysot's factory. They wanted to thank the workers, the men and women on the production line who had built the gun they believed had kept them alive. Those veterans knew in their bones that they had come home because of what came out of that factory. By the time most of them made those visits, Evelyn was already dead. There is no simple lesson in this story. There is no clean moral. A young man with almost no formal education built a weapon that outperformed the products of the two most powerful industrial empires on Earth. His own army tried to bury it. His own government had to override its generals to save it. The British had to admit their gun was worse. The Americans had to admit their gun was worse. Soldiers of three nations traded away their weapons to get one of his. And he died alone at 33 in a hospital bed from a bottle that killed him more slowly than any bullet. The Owen Machine Carbine was never elegant. It was heavy. It was awkward. It looked like something a man had welded together in a shed, because that is exactly what it was. But when the Sten exploded, and the Thompson jammed, and the mud of New Guinea swallowed better-looking weapons whole, the Owen fired. Every round, every time. That is what engineering looks like when it is done. Not for beauty, not for pride, not for a contract, but for the man who has to carry the thing into the fight. That is what happens when a boy with no credentials and a lifetime of failures builds something that works. The gun outlived its inventor by more than 20 years. The soldiers who carried it outlived him too. Many of them came home, raised children, grew old, told stories to grandchildren about a strange-looking gun with the magazine on top that never let them down in the jungle. They lived because of Evelyn Owen, and Evelyn Owen did not live to see it. The mud could not stop the Owen gun. Nothing in the Pacific could stop the Owen gun. But the man who made it could not stop himself. And in the end, at 33 years old, in a hospital in Wollongong, that was the only fight he lost.